Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Three in the morning. It's always 3 in the morning when I wake up hearing those sounds again. My new house is over 1,000 miles from Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but still, I still hear them. My wife says they're just nightmares. She wasn't there. She didn't see what I saw that October night. My name is Kieran Ashworth, and I need to tell someone this story. I was a forest ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 6 years before everything went to hell in the autumn of 2021. Now I live in Albuquerque, where the landscape is open and dry, where you can see for miles in every direction. No thick canopies, no shadows that move on their own, no places for things to hide. I've been in therapy for 3 years now. Dr. Martinez keeps telling me that talking about it will help, that keeping it bottled up is what's causing the nightmares, the panic attacks, the way I can't handle being in any wooded area without my heart rate spiking to dangerous levels. So here I am, finally ready to tell the complete story of what happened during the Delila Vance case, the case that made me turn in my badge and move as far from those mountains as I could get. If you don't believe there are things in this world that can't be explained by science or logic, you might want to stop reading now. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. Hell, I would have laughed at anyone telling me this story before October 2021. But I was there. I saw what I saw. And some things don't leave your head no matter how much you want them to. Everything started normal enough. October 15th, 2021, was one of those perfect autumn days in the Smokies that make you understand why millions of people visit every year. The leaves were at peak color, brilliant reds and golds covering the mountains like God had taken a paintbrush to the whole landscape. Temperature was a crisp 58 degrees, light wind from the southwest, visibility clear for miles. I remember thinking it was going to be a quiet day. I was wrong. The call came in around 2:30 p.m. from the Gatlinburg Dispatch. A graduate student from the University of Virginia named Delila Vance had failed to check in at her scheduled time. She'd registered for a 3-day solo research trip, studying Appalachian folklore and oral traditions. Her faculty advisor had expected contact by 2 p.m., and when she didn't call, they'd contacted the Park Service. Now, delayed check-ins happen all the time. Cell service in the Smokies is spotty at best, and researchers get caught up in their work. But something about this one felt different from the moment I got the details. Delila was experienced. She'd done solo trips before, always followed protocols to the letter. And her research area was deep in the backcountry, up near the old Cherokee settlement sites on the Tennessee side. I know those mountains like the back of my hand, every trail and game path. 6 years of ranger work will do that. But even experienced rangers don't like going into that particular area alone, especially as autumn turns toward winter. There's something about those old settlement sites, something that predates the park, predates even the Cherokee in some ways. The other rangers used to joke about it, how the wildlife avoided certain areas, how your radio would get strange interference, how you'd sometimes hear things that couldn't be identified. I wasn't laughing that day. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Patricia Hensley, assigned me to coordinate the initial search. Standard protocol: check the registered research sites first, then expand the search grid if necessary. I took Ranger Jake Morrison with me, a good kid with 2 years' experience. We loaded up with standard gear, GPS units, emergency medical supplies, extra batteries for everything, emergency flares, and enough provisions for an overnight search if needed. The drive up to the Cosby area took about 40 minutes. That whole region is remote, accessible only by a winding mountain road that gets treacherous once you're more than a few miles from the main park roads. We parked at the Cosby Creek trailhead and began hiking toward Delila's first registered research site, an area near the remnants of an old Cherokee village about 4 miles in. The hike started normal. Jake was chatty, talking about his weekend plans, complaining about the new GPS units that had been giving everyone trouble lately. The trail was well maintained, clearly marked, and we made good time through the first 2 miles. But as we got deeper into the backcountry, something started feeling off. First, it was the quiet. The Smokies are never truly silent. There's always something rustling in the underbrush, birds calling, insects buzzing. But as we climbed higher, the natural sounds seemed to fade away. By the time we reached the 3-mile marker, I realized I couldn't hear any wildlife at all. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Jake noticed it too. "Weird how quiet it is up here," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the still air. That's when we found the first sign of Delilah's presence, her research notebook, lying open beside the trail about a 1/4 mile from her registered site. The pages were wet from the morning dew, but readable. Her handwriting was neat, methodical. Notes about Cherokee oral traditions, stories about the hungry places in the mountains, legends about things that lived in the deep woods and came out when the seasons changed. What bothered me was the location. The notebook was just sitting there in the middle of the trail, not tucked away where someone might have stopped to take notes. It looked like it had been dropped or thrown. We marked the GPS coordinates and continued toward the research site. That's when Jake's radio started acting up. "Base, this is Ashworth and Morrison. We're approaching Site Alpha," I said into my radio. The response was nothing but static, broken by what sounded almost like whispers. Not words I could make out, just the rhythm of human speech buried in the white noise. Jake tried his radio with the same result. We checked the batteries. Full charge. Tried switching channels. Same static on every frequency. In 6 years of working these mountains, I'd never experienced a complete communication blackout like that. "Probably just a dead zone," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We'll try again when we get back to higher ground." The research site was a clearing about 100 yards off the main trail, near the stone foundations of what had once been a Cherokee dwelling. According to the park records, the site had been abandoned sometime in the early 1800s, long before the Trail of Tears, which was unusual. Most Cherokee settlements in the area had been forcibly removed, but this one appeared to have been left voluntarily. We found Delilah's camp immediately. Her tent was still set up, guy lines tight, rainfly properly secured, but the front flap was wide open, which was strange for someone camping alone in October. Her sleeping bag was half out of the tent, as if she'd been dragged from it. Inside the tent, everything was organized. Her clothes were folded, her research materials neatly stacked, her camping stove and food supplies untouched. But her hiking boots were missing, and there was no sign of her day pack or water bottles. Jake started processing the campsite while I examined the surrounding area for tracks. The ground was soft from recent rains, perfect for preserving footprints. I found Delilah's boot prints leading away from the camp toward the old stone foundations, but after about 20 feet, the tracks just stopped. Not like she'd reached hard ground or rock. They literally ended in the middle of soft earth, as if she'd simply vanished mid-step. "Kieran, you need to see this," Jake called from behind the tent. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, staring at something carved into the bark of a massive oak tree. At first glance, it looked like typical vandalism. Someone had carved symbols into the bark with a knife. But as I got closer, I realized the symbols weren't random. They were arranged in a pattern, like writing in a language I didn't recognize. Below the symbols, carved much more recently, were the words, "She's mine now." The carving was fresh, the sap still bleeding from the cuts in the bark. Someone had been here very recently, possibly even while we were hiking up the trail. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice calling for help, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, beyond the Cherokee ruins. Jake heard it too. I could see it in his eyes, the way his head turned toward the sound. "Delilah," he called out. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me. Please, I'm hurt." Every instinct I'd developed in 6 years of ranger work was screaming at me that something was wrong. The voice was too clear, too perfectly audible despite the distance. And there was something off about the tone, like someone trying very hard to sound distressed, but not quite getting it right. But Jake was already moving toward the voice, his handheld radio in one hand, first aid kit in the other. "Delila, keep calling out. We're coming to you." I grabbed his arm. "Wait." Something's not right about this. What do you mean? She's calling for help. She might be injured. The voice came again, and this time I was sure. It was coming from at least 3 different directions simultaneously. No echo would do that, not in these mountains. Jake, that's not possible. Listen carefully. We stood in complete silence for 30 seconds. Then the voice came again and Jake's face went pale. He heard it too, the same woman's voice, calling from the north, south, and east all at the same time. What the hell is that? He whispered. Before I could answer, we heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy boots moving through the underbrush, circling our position. But every time we turned toward the sound, it would stop, then start again from a different direction. I drew my service weapon and motioned for Jake to do the same. In 6 years, I'd never drawn my gun on duty except for training. Bears, even aggressive ones, don't require firearms. But this wasn't a bear. "This is Ranger Ashworth," I called out loudly. "Identify yourself. We're conducting an official search and rescue operation." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the woods were silent again. Then, from somewhere behind the Cherokee ruins, came the sound of laughter. Low, male, amused, like someone enjoying a private joke. Jake's hands were shaking as he tried his radio again. Still nothing but static, and those strange whisper sounds buried in the white noise. That's when I made the decision that probably saved our lives, at least temporarily. We're leaving, now. But Delila is not the one calling for help. Move. I pushed Jake ahead of me back toward the main trail, keeping my weapon drawn, constantly checking behind us. The footsteps started again as soon as we began moving, always maintaining the same distance, never getting closer but never falling behind either. We made it back to the trailhead in record time, both of us practically running the last mile. As soon as we reached the parking area, our radios crackled back to life. "Base to Ashworth, what's your status?" Chief Hensley's voice was crystal clear. "We found Vance's campsite, but she's not there. We need to establish a command post and organize a full search team. And Chief, we need to treat this as a potential criminal situation." Back at headquarters, I briefed Chief Hensley on everything we'd found, though I left out the part about the voices coming from multiple directions. That would have sounded crazy, and I needed her to take the criminal angle seriously. The carved message was enough to justify treating this as more than a simple missing person case. She agreed to contact the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and establish a joint operation. But she also made it clear that we couldn't wait for outside help. If Delila was still alive, time was critical. By 6 p.m., we had a full search team assembled. 12 rangers, including myself and Jake, plus 2 TBI agents who'd driven up from Knoxville. We set up a command post at the Cosby Creek trailhead and divided into teams of 3, each covering a different sector of the search area. Chief Hensley assigned me to lead Team Alpha, with Jake and a veteran ranger named Carol Winters. Carol had 15 years' experience in the Smokies and knew the backcountry better than anyone. If anyone could help us navigate the psychological aspects of what we'd encountered, it would be her. We planned to return to Delila's campsite after dark, using night vision equipment and thermal imaging. The theory was that if someone was holding her in the area, they might be more active at night, thinking they were safe from search teams. I should have trusted my instincts and refused the assignment. The hike back up to the research site in the dark was completely different from our afternoon trip. With night vision goggles, the familiar trail became an alien landscape of green-tinted shadows and strange shapes. Every tree looked threatening. Every sound seemed amplified and distorted. But it was Carol who first noticed that something was fundamentally wrong with the environment. "The temperature's all wrong," she said when we were about 2 miles up the trail. "Look at your thermometer." I checked the digital readout on my pack. 62 degrees Fahrenheit. That was impossible. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s by sunset, and it should have been even colder at this elevation. Jake checked his reading. Same result. We were in a pocket of warm air that had no natural explanation. "Maybe it's a thermal vent," Jake suggested. "Underground hot spring or something." Carol shook her head. I've hiked this trail 100 times. There are no thermal features in this area. As we climbed higher, the temperature kept fluctuating wildly. 1 minute we'd be in normal October cold, the next we'd hit a pocket of air so warm it felt like July. Our breath would be visible 1 second, then completely normal the next. By the time we reached Delila's campsite, all 3 of our thermometers were reading different temperatures, ranging from 38 to 74 degrees. Our equipment was malfunctioning in ways that made no sense. The campsite looked exactly as we'd left it, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. Delilah's sleeping bag, which had been half pulled out of the tent that afternoon, was now neatly arranged inside the tent, zipped up as if someone was sleeping in it. Carol drew her weapon. Someone's been here since this afternoon. I approached the tent carefully, my flashlight trained on the entrance. Delila, if you're in there, this is the Park Service. You're safe now. No response. I could see the outline of a human form inside the sleeping bag, but it wasn't moving. No visible breathing. Jake positioned himself on the other side of the tent while Carol covered the tree line. I unzipped the tent flap slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The sleeping bag was full, shaped like a human body. But when I unzipped it, there was nothing inside except dead leaves and small animal bones arranged in the rough shape of a person. "What the fuck?" Jake whispered. That's when we heard the voice again. Delilah's voice calling from the woods beyond the Cherokee ruins. But this time it wasn't calling for help. It was singing. A lullaby, soft and sweet like a mother singing to a child. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but the words were wrong. Not English, not Cherokee, not any language I'd ever heard. And the voice was getting closer. Carol grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Right now." I wanted to argue, wanted to stay and find Delila, but every instinct I had was screaming danger. The singing was definitely getting closer, and now I could hear footsteps accompanying it, multiple sets of footsteps moving in perfect synchronization with the melody. We packed our gear in record time and started back down the trail, but we'd only gone about 100 yards when Jake stopped dead. "Look at your GPS," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I checked my unit. According to the GPS, we were moving in a perfect circle. The trail that should have led us back to the parking area was somehow looping back on itself. We'd been walking downhill for 10 minutes, but the GPS showed us returning to our starting point. Carol checked her unit. Same reading. We were trapped in some kind of geographic impossibility. "This is equipment failure," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. "All our electronics are malfunctioning. We navigate by compass and landmarks." But when I checked my compass, the needle was spinning slowly in complete circles, never settling on any particular direction. The singing had stopped, but now we could hear something else. Breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing coming from all around us, as if the forest itself was alive and watching us. That's when I saw the first shadow figure. It was standing about 30 feet off the trail, perfectly motionless, darker than the surrounding darkness even through our night vision goggles. Human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, arms that hung just a little too long. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Carol. She was already aiming her weapon at it. "I see it." Jake turned his night vision in that direction, and the figure was gone. Just gone. Not like it had moved away, but like it had never been there at all. "Where did it go?" Jake asked. Carol and I exchanged glances. We'd both seen the same thing, but Jake's equipment showed nothing. That's when I realized our night vision units were showing different images. Carol and I were seeing the same distorted, threatening version of the forest, full of moving shadows and impossible shapes. But Jake's equipment was showing normal woods, empty and peaceful. "Jake, what do you see right now?" "Just trees. Normal forest." "Why?" I looked through my night vision again and saw at least 6 shadow figures standing motionless between the trees, all facing us. Carol was counting them too, her weapon trained on the nearest one. "7, she whispered. I count 7 of them. Jake switched to thermal imaging. I'm not reading any heat signatures. Nothing larger than small animals. The figures started moving. Not walking exactly, but gliding between the trees, maintaining their distance but clearly repositioning themselves. They were surrounding us. We run, I said. Pick a direction and run. I chose what I hoped was downhill and started moving as fast as I dared in the dark. Carol and Jake followed, all of us stumbling over roots and rocks, branches tearing at our clothes and gear. Behind us, the singing started again. But now it wasn't Delilah's voice. It was a chorus of voices, men and women and children, all singing the same wordless lullaby. And they were getting closer. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Finally, I couldn't go any further and called for a rest. We'd reached a small clearing that I didn't recognize, which was impossible. I knew every clearing in this section of the park. Jake collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. Carol was checking her equipment, trying to get a fix on our location. I think we're lost, she said. I pulled out my emergency GPS unit, the backup system that should have worked even if all our other electronics failed. The screen showed our location as a coordinate that didn't exist, latitude and longitude numbers that would have placed us somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This is impossible, I said. GPS satellites don't fail like this. That's when we heard the breathing again, much closer now. And footsteps. Human footsteps, but with an odd rhythm, like someone with an uneven gait. A man stepped into the clearing. He was tall, maybe 6'4", wearing military-style camouflage clothing and combat boots. His hair was long and unkempt, his beard streaked with gray. But it was his eyes that made my blood freeze. They reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's eyes, bright and predatory. "You boys lost?" he asked, his voice carrying a thick Tennessee mountain accent. I kept my weapon drawn but not directly aimed at him. "We're Park Service Rangers conducting a search and rescue operation. Have you seen a young woman in this area? Graduate student traveling alone?" The man smiled, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Oh, I seen her all right. Pretty little thing. Asked too many questions, though. Had to teach her some manners." Carol had moved to flank him, her weapon ready. "Where is she?" "Safe and sound. Learning about the old ways, the hungry ways." He gestured toward the trees around us. "These mountains got appetites, you know. Been feeding them for years now. Hikers, campers, researchers like your little friend. The mountains appreciate it." Jake was trying to work his radio, but all we got was static mixed with what sounded like screaming. "You're under arrest," I said, raising my weapon. "Put your hands where I can see them." The man laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Arrest? Boy, you don't understand where you are. This ain't your jurisdiction anymore. This is the hungry place." He stepped backward toward the tree line, but instead of disappearing into the forest, he seemed to merge with the shadows. 1 second he was there, solid and real. The next he was part of the darkness between the trees. "He's gone," Jake whispered. But Carol was pointing her flashlight at the trees where the man had been standing. Carved into the bark of multiple trees were symbols like the ones we'd found at Delilah's campsite. But these were older, deeper, stained dark with what looked like dried blood. And hanging from one of the branches was a piece of fabric. Pink flannel, torn and dirty. The kind of shirt a graduate student might wear on a research trip. The singing started again, but now it was coming from directly above us. I aimed my flashlight up into the canopy and saw something that made me question my sanity. There were people in the trees, at least a dozen of them, sitting on branches that shouldn't have been able to support human weight, all singing that wordless lullaby. Men, women, children, all dressed in modern hiking clothes, but wrong somehow. Their movements too fluid, their positions too perfectly balanced. One of them was Delila. She was sitting on a branch about 40 feet up, her legs dangling, swaying gently back and forth as she sang. Her eyes were open, but completely black, no whites visible. When she saw me looking at her, she smiled and waved. "Found her," Carol said, her voice hollow. Jake was backing toward the far edge of the clearing, his weapon drawn but shaking. "Those people in the trees, they're not alive. Look at them. Really look at them." He was right. In the harsh glare of our flashlights, I could see that the singers weren't quite human anymore. Their skin had a grayish pallor, their movements were too synchronized, and some of them had injuries that should have been fatal. Deep gashes, missing limbs, twisted necks, but they kept singing. "Delila," I called up to her. "Come down, we're here to help you." She tilted her head at an impossible angle, almost 90 degrees to the left, and spoke in a voice that wasn't quite her own anymore. "Help?" she said, her words echoing strangely in the clearing. "I don't need help. I'm home now. I'm feeding the hungry place. Just like all the others." The other figures in the trees turned to look at us, dozens of black eyes reflecting our lights. Then as one, they began to climb down. "Run," I said. We ran. This time I didn't care about direction or navigation. I just picked the darkest part of the forest and ran toward it, hoping against hope that we'd find a way out of whatever nightmare we'd stumbled into. Behind us, the singing continued, but now it was accompanied by the sound of feet hitting the ground. Lots of feet, all moving in the same rhythm. They were following us, but not hurrying, like they knew we couldn't really escape. We crashed through underbrush, splashed across streams I didn't recognize, climbed over fallen trees that seemed to appear out of nowhere. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were on fire. But I kept moving because stopping meant being caught by whatever those things were. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into another clearing, this one larger and somehow familiar. In the center was a fire pit with fresh ashes, and scattered around it were dozens of personal belongings. Backpacks, hiking boots, water bottles, cameras. The belongings of people who had never made it home. "This is his base camp," Carol said, examining a driver's license she'd found near the fire pit. "Look at the dates on these IDs. People have been disappearing here for years." The most recent ID belonged to a hiker from last month. The oldest was from 2018. 12 people minimum, all vanished in this area of the park. Jake was checking his equipment again. "Radio's working," he said. "I'm getting clear signal." "Base, this is Morrison," he said into his radio. "We need immediate backup at coordinates." He checked his GPS. "Shit, I'm still showing impossible coordinates." But Chief Hensley's voice came back clear as day. "Morrison, what's your status? You're 3 hours overdue for check-in. We found evidence of multiple missing persons, Chief, and we've made contact with a suspect, armed and dangerous. We need helicopter support and a full tactical team." "Negative on helicopter support. Weather's moving in. Heavy fog and high winds. Can you make it back to base?" I took the radio. "Chief, this is Ashworth. We need to evacuate this area immediately. Clear all campsites within a 5-mile radius. This isn't just a missing person case." "Explain. How do you explain the impossible? How do you tell your supervisor that you found evidence of serial killings mixed with supernatural phenomena that defies every law of physics you know?" "We found evidence of multiple homicides, Chief. Ritualistic killings. The suspect appears to be using local folklore and terrain to terrorize victims. We need federal support." "Copy that. I'm contacting FBI and state police. Can you maintain your position until backup arrives?" I looked around the clearing full of victims' belongings, then up at the trees where shadows moved independently of any wind. "Negative, Chief. We're moving back to base now. Do not send anyone else into this area until we have full tactical support." "Understood. Be safe, Ashworth." The radio went dead. As soon as the communication ended, the singing started again. But this time it was coming from all around us. Not just from the trees, but from the ground beneath our feet, from the air itself. The shadows began moving faster, darting between the trees, getting closer to our position, and somewhere in the darkness, I could hear that man's voice laughing. "You can't leave," he called out. "Nobody leaves the hungry place, not once they've seen the feeders, not once they know the truth." Carol grabbed my arm. "Look at the fire pit." The ashes were glowing, getting brighter, and I could see shapes forming in them, human shapes writhing and reaching upward. "He's been burning them," she whispered. That's how he feeds the... whatever this is. He's been sacrificing people to something that lives in these mountains. Jake was backing away from the fire pit, his weapon trained on the growing glow. Those aren't ashes. Look at them move. The shapes in the fire pit were definitely moving, pressing upward against some invisible barrier, their mouths open in silent screams. And they were getting stronger, more defined, more able to push through whatever was keeping them contained. That's when I made the connection. The Cherokee oral traditions that Delila had been researching, stories about hungry places in the mountains, ancient spirits that demanded sacrifice. The reason this particular settlement had been abandoned voluntarily, long before the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee had known about this place. They'd known what lived here, and they'd left to keep it contained. But someone had figured out how to wake it up, how to feed it, how to use it. We have to destroy the fire pit, I said. That's the focal point. That's how he's been controlling whatever this is. Carol nodded. Our emergency explosives. We can collapse the whole clearing. Each search team carried small charges for emergency situations, clearing fallen trees, opening blocked trails, creating fire breaks. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to disrupt whatever ritual site this had become. Jake was already pulling the charges from his pack when the man stepped out of the shadows again. But this time, he wasn't alone. The singers from the trees were with him, including Delila. But they weren't the same people we'd seen before. They moved wrong, jerky, and unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. And their eyes were completely black, reflecting our lights like polished obsidian. You don't understand what you're doing, the man said. This place has been hungry for centuries. I'm just helping it eat, keeping it satisfied so it doesn't spread to the towns, the cities. I'm protecting people. By murdering them, by choosing who gets taken. Better a few hikers and researchers than whole communities. He gestured to his followers. These people understand now. They're part of something bigger, something ancient and powerful. Delila stepped forward, her movements unnaturally fluid. When she spoke, her voice had that same echoing quality I'd heard before. Join us, she said. Stop fighting and join us. The hungry place will make you whole. The other figures began to spread out, surrounding us again. But this time they were moving with purpose, coordinating their positions like a military unit. Set the charges, I told Carol. Now. She began placing the small explosive devices around the fire pit while Jake and I kept our weapons trained on the approaching figures. They weren't moving fast, but they were persistent, inexorable. 30 seconds, Carol called out. The man laughed. 30 seconds to live, you mean? You think you can destroy something that's been here since before your ancestors learned to make fire? You think a few little explosives can hurt the hungry place? 20 seconds. The figures stopped their advance and began singing again, that wordless lullaby that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The fire pit glowed brighter, and I could see more shapes forming in the ashes, pressing harder against whatever barrier contained them. 10 seconds. Everyone down. We hit the ground, covering our heads. The explosion was smaller than I'd hoped, but it achieved what we needed. The fire pit collapsed, sending rocks and dirt flying in all directions. The singing stopped abruptly, cut off like someone had unplugged a radio. When the smoke cleared, the figures were gone. All of them, including the man and Delila. Just gone, like they'd never been there at all. But the clearing wasn't empty. Scattered around the destroyed fire pit were bones, human bones, charred and broken, mixed with personal belongings and scraps of clothing. Evidence of years of killings, finally exposed. My radio's working, Jake said. Clear signal, normal GPS coordinates. I checked my equipment. Everything was functioning normally. According to my GPS, we were exactly where we should be, in a documented clearing about 3 miles from the main trail. Base, this is Ashworth. We've found multiple homicide victims and evidence of serial killings. We need forensic teams and a full crime scene investigation. Chief Hensley's voice came back immediately. Copy that, Ashworth. What's the status of the missing person? I looked at the bones scattered around the destroyed fire pit, trying to process what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, what I was going to tell my supervisor and the FBI agents who would inevitably want a full report. Delila Vance is deceased, Chief. Multiple victims found. Suspect is, we need to expand the search area. He may have fled to secondary locations. How do you tell your boss that you've encountered something that exists outside the normal rules of reality? How do you explain that a serial killer has been using supernatural forces to hunt and kill people in a national park? You don't. You stick to the facts that can be documented, photographed, and explained in court. The FBI found the remains of 14 people in that clearing over the next 3 days. Forensic evidence confirmed multiple homicides spanning at least 4 years. The suspect was never apprehended, despite a massive manhunt involving federal agents, state police, and park rangers from 3 different agencies. Officially, the case remains open. The media called it the Smoky Mountain Killer case, and it generated enough publicity to temporarily reduce tourism to the area. But after a few months, people forgot, and the hikers came back. They always do. I submitted my resignation 2 weeks after the investigation concluded. Chief Hensley tried to talk me out of it, said I was a good ranger with a bright future, but every time I looked at those mountains, every time I walked into any forested area, I could hear that singing, that wordless lullaby that seemed to call to something deep in the mountains, something that was still hungry. My wife and I moved to New Mexico 3 months later. I told her it was for better job opportunities, a chance to work in a different kind of landscape. I didn't tell her about the nightmares, about waking up at 3 in the morning convinced I could hear voices calling from the desert outside our house. I didn't tell her that I'd installed motion sensor lights around our entire property, or that I sleep with a loaded pistol in the nightstand drawer. Dr. Martinez says I have PTSD from the traumatic experience of finding multiple murder victims. She says the supernatural elements I remember are my mind's way of processing something too horrible to accept at face value. She says that with time and therapy, the nightmares will fade, the hypervigilance will decrease, and I'll be able to return to a normal life. She's probably right about the PTSD, but she wasn't there. She didn't see what I saw in those mountains. She didn't hear Delila singing from the trees, didn't watch a serial killer step through shadows like they were doorways, didn't feel the presence of something ancient and hungry stirring beneath the familiar landscape of a national park. The official FBI report lists the suspect as unknown male, approximately 40-50 years old, military training, intimate knowledge of local terrain. They theorize that he used psychological warfare tactics and knowledge of local folklore to terrorize his victims before killing them. They believe he's still active, possibly in another state, another national park. They're probably right about that too, but they don't know about the other things I found during those 3 days of investigation. Things I never put in my official report, things that would have gotten me dismissed from the service and possibly committed for psychological evaluation. On the second day of the crime scene investigation, I went back to the area alone. Officially, I was checking for additional evidence. Unofficially, I needed to understand what had really happened to us that night. I needed to know if it was over. The clearing looked completely normal in daylight, just a small meadow with the remains of an old fire pit, surrounded by typical Appalachian forest. The FBI had removed all the human remains and most of the personal belongings. Crime scene tape marked the perimeter, and there were numbered evidence markers scattered around the area. But when I examined the trees where I'd seen the singers, I found something the forensic team had missed. Carved into the bark, about 15 feet up, were symbols that matched the ones from Delila's campsite, but these were much older, weathered by years of exposure, and they were cut deep, deeper than any knife could reach. The symbols were arranged in a perfect circle around the clearing, one set on each of the 12 largest trees, like a ritual boundary, like something designed to contain whatever lived in the fire pit. I borrowed climbing gear from the park's equipment cache and went up to examine the symbols more closely. What I found made me understand why the Cherokee had abandoned this place. The symbols weren't just carved into the bark. They were burned in, scorched deep into the wood by some intense heat source. But the trees were still alive, still healthy, growing around the scars. Trees don't survive that kind of thermal damage. They die, fall down, decay, unless something is keeping them alive for a purpose. At the base of each marked tree, I found small deposits of ash and bone fragments that the forensic team had missed. Human remains, but older than anything we'd found in the fire pit. Much older. Some of the bone fragments were stained with mineral deposits that suggested they'd been in the ground for decades, possibly centuries. This place had been a killing ground for a very long time. Long before the man we'd encountered. Long before the park was established. Long before European settlers arrived in the mountains. On my radio, I could hear the FBI agents coordinating their search efforts, expanding their grid to look for additional evidence. They were good at their jobs, thorough and professional. But they were looking for a human predator using conventional investigative techniques. They weren't looking for something that had been feeding on human sacrifice since before recorded history. That afternoon, I hiked back to Delila's original campsite. The area had been processed as part of the crime scene, but I wanted to see it again with fresh eyes. I needed to understand how a graduate student researching folklore had ended up as part of something that belonged in her research notes. Her tent was gone, taken as evidence, but the stone foundations of the Cherokee dwelling were still there. In daylight, they looked like what they were supposed to be, remnants of a small house, abandoned long ago, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But when I examined them more closely, I realized they weren't the foundations of a dwelling at all. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, with smaller circles nested inside. The pattern was complex, geometric, purposeful. It looked less like architecture and more like a diagram, or a map, or instructions for something. I took photographs with my personal camera, careful not to disturb anything the FBI might want to examine later. But as I was taking the pictures, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The stone circle was changing. Not dramatically, not obviously. But each time I looked through the camera viewfinder, the arrangement was slightly different. Stones that had been touching were now separated by inches. Gaps that had been empty now contained small rocks that definitely hadn't been there before. I watched for 10 minutes, taking photographs every 30 seconds. When I reviewed the images later, each one showed a different configuration of the stones. They were moving, rearranging themselves into new patterns, slowly but definitely. That's when I understood what Delila had really discovered during her research. She hadn't just been studying folklore. She'd been documenting something real, something active, something that was still happening in these mountains, and she'd attracted its attention. I left the site that day with a camera full of evidence that I would never show to anyone. Evidence that would have ended my career and destroyed my credibility. Evidence that some things in this world operate according to rules that science hasn't discovered yet. But I kept the photographs. Even now, 3 years later, I still look at them sometimes. The stone circle, rearranging itself according to some ancient pattern, proof that what we encountered that night was real, was active, was still out there. The third day of the investigation brought news that confirmed my worst fears. 2 hikers had gone missing from a campground about 20 miles south of our crime scene. A young couple from Georgia, experienced backpackers who knew the area well. They'd checked in at the ranger station, followed all the proper protocols, and simply vanished. Their campsite was found abandoned, just like Delila's. Their belongings were undisturbed, but there were signs of a struggle and fresh carvings on nearby trees. The same symbols we'd found at the original site. The FBI expanded their search area and brought in additional agents. The media picked up the story, and suddenly the Smokies were crawling with reporters, amateur investigators, and thrill seekers hoping to catch a glimpse of the Smoky Mountain Killer. But I knew the truth. The man we'd encountered wasn't operating alone, and he wasn't the real threat. He was just a servant, a facilitator for something much older and much more dangerous. Something that had been contained by Cherokee rituals for centuries, but was now free to expand its influence. Something that was still hungry. I submitted my resignation that afternoon. Chief Hensley accepted it reluctantly, and I spent my last week as a park ranger, helping to coordinate the expanded search effort. But I was careful to stay away from the deep backcountry, and I made sure I was never alone in the forest. because I could still hear the singing. It was faint, barely audible above the normal sounds of the forest, but it was there, that wordless lullaby, calling from the depths of the mountains. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, I could hear other voices mixed in with it. Voices of people who had disappeared, people who had been taken to feed the hungry place, voices that were still singing, somewhere in the darkness between the trees. The young couple from Georgia was never found. Neither were the 3 solo hikers who disappeared over the following 2 months. The FBI's task force was eventually scaled back, then disbanded altogether. The case remains open but inactive. The Park Service instituted new safety protocols and increased ranger patrols. But hikers still disappear in the Smokies every year. Most of them are found eventually, lost, injured, but alive. The normal casualties of wilderness recreation. But some of them aren't found at all. Some of them just vanish into the mountains, leaving behind abandoned campsites and personal belongings and families who will never know what really happened. I moved to New Mexico because the landscape here is open, visible, honest. You can see for miles in every direction. There are no thick forests, no hidden valleys, no places where ancient things might hide and wait for travelers to feed their hunger. But even here, in the high desert where everything is exposed to the sun and wind, I sometimes hear that singing. Usually at 3 in the morning when I'm jolted awake by nightmares I can't quite remember. Usually when the wind is blowing from the east, carrying sounds and scents from places I've never been. My wife thinks it's tinnitus, a stress-related condition brought on by the trauma of finding multiple murder victims. She's scheduled me appointments with specialists, and I've undergone hearing tests that show my ears are perfectly normal. But the singing isn't in my ears. It's deeper than that, more fundamental. It's in my bones, in my blood, in the part of my brain that still remembers what it was like to be prey in a world full of predators. Dr. Martinez says I'm making good progress. The nightmares are less frequent. The hypervigilance is manageable. And I've started sleeping through the night more often. She thinks I might be ready to return to outdoor work soon, maybe as a guide or instructor for wilderness programs. She doesn't know that I've started researching similar disappearances in other national parks. Patterns of missing persons that match what we found in the Smokies. Remote areas where people vanish without explanation, where search teams find abandoned campsites and strange symbols carved into trees. It's happening in Yellowstone, in Glacier, in the Olympic Peninsula, and the Adirondacks. Dozens of cases, spread across the country, all following the same basic pattern. Experienced hikers disappearing from areas with historical significance, areas where indigenous peoples once practiced religious ceremonies or established sacred sites, areas that might contain other hungry places. I've started corresponding with retired park rangers, law enforcement officers, and search and rescue personnel who've worked these cases. Most of them stick to the official explanations: predators, both human and animal, natural disasters, simple accidents. But a few of them, late at night in private emails, admit to experiencing things they can't explain. Strange sounds in the forest, equipment failures that defy rational explanation, witnesses who describe impossible phenomena, evidence that disappears or changes when no one is looking. And always, somewhere in the background, that wordless singing. There's a network of people who know the truth, who've encountered these hungry places and survived to tell about it. We don't meet in person, and we don't use official channels. But we share information, we track patterns, and we try to warn others when we can. We call ourselves the Witnesses. Last month I received an email from a former ranger in Olympic National Park. 3 hikers had gone missing from an area near some old Kino ceremonial sites. Their campsite had been found abandoned, their belongings undisturbed, fresh carvings on nearby trees. The same symbols I'd photographed in the Smokies. I forwarded the information to 2 other witnesses, a retired FBI agent in Montana and a search and rescue coordinator in Colorado. Within a week, we'd identified similar incidents in 4 other locations, all occurring within the past 6 months. The hungry places are waking up. All of them. Something is calling to them, activating them, teaching them to feed more efficiently. And I think I know what that something is. The man we encountered in the Smokies wasn't unique. He was part of a larger group, a network of people who've learned how to communicate with these ancient entities, how to serve them, how to profit from their hunger. They're creating new feeding grounds, expanding the territory of the hungry places, turning our national parks into hunting preserves for things that should have remained buried and forgotten. And there's nothing we can do to stop them. The official channels won't listen. How do you convince a federal agency that serial killers are using supernatural forces to hunt victims in national parks? How do you file a report about entities that exist outside the normal rules of physics and biology? You don't. You document what you can, warn who you will listen, and hope that someday someone with more resources and credibility will take up the fight. But until then, the hungry places keep feeding. The network keeps growing, and people keep disappearing into the wilderness thinking they're safe in places protected by the government, managed by professionals, patrolled by rangers who know the territory. They don't know that some of the territory knows them back. They don't know that in certain remote areas, in places where the boundary between our world and older worlds has grown thin, the landscape itself is watching them, evaluating them, deciding whether they're worth taking. And they don't know that once the hungry places have tasted human sacrifice, once they've been awakened and fed by people who understand their true nature, they never go back to sleep. 3 a.m. I'm awake again, listening to the wind carry sounds from places I've never been. Voices singing songs in languages that predate human civilization. My wife is sleeping peacefully beside me, dreaming ordinary dreams about ordinary problems. She doesn't hear what I hear. Most people don't. But sometimes when I'm talking to other witnesses, comparing notes about disappearances and strange phenomena, I wonder if the ability to hear the singing is a gift or a curse. Maybe it means we're marked somehow, chosen by the hungry places as potential servants or sacrifices. Maybe we survived our encounters not because we were smart or brave or lucky, but because something wanted us to survive, wanted us to carry the knowledge of what exists out there in the darkness between the trees. Maybe we're not witnesses at all. Maybe we're recruiters. I close my eyes and try to block out the singing, try to focus on the normal sounds of a New Mexico night, wind through desert plants, distant traffic, the hum of the air conditioning. Normal sounds from a normal world where terrible things happen for understandable reasons. But underneath it all, threading through the ordinary noise like a melody played on instruments made from human bone, I can still hear that wordless lullaby calling from the hungry places. And sometimes, God help me, I find myself humming along. This account was recorded during a private interview session in Albuquerque, New Mexico, on March 15, 2024. The subject has requested anonymity and has declined to participate in any official investigation. All names and specific locations have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved and to prevent copycat incidents. If you are planning to visit any remote areas of America's national parks, please follow all safety protocols, travel in groups, and maintain regular contact with park authorities. And if you hear singing in the woods where no singers should be, don't follow the sound. Turn around and walk away as quickly as you can. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. 3 a.m. It's always 3 a.m. when I wake up hearing those sounds again. My new house is over 1,000 miles from Olympic National Park, but still, I still hear them. My wife says they're just nightmares. She wasn't there. She didn't see what I saw that October night. My name is Thane Whitmore, and I need to tell someone this story. It's been 8 years since I left Washington and moved here to Vermont, where the forests are different, younger, quieter, less ancient. The mountains here don't carry the same weight, don't hold the same secrets. But even now, when I look out at the green mountains from my kitchen window, I sometimes catch myself listening for those voices in the mist. I was a forest ranger for 7 years at Olympic National Park. 7 years of thinking I knew every danger those woods could throw at you. Black bears, cougars, hypothermia, flash floods, the occasional lost hiker who panicked and made bad decisions. I thought the worst thing you could encounter out there was your own stupidity or Mother Nature's indifference. I was wrong. Completely, terrifyingly wrong. The Iris Blackwood case was supposed to be routine, a 19-year-old college student from Portland State, an art major specializing in wilderness photography. She'd gotten her backcountry permit like she was supposed to, filed her itinerary, even left emergency contacts. Smart girl, experienced for her age. She'd been camping solo in the Olympics since she was 16. Always came back with these haunting photographs of old-growth forest that looked like something out of a fairy tale. When she didn't check in at the Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center on October 15, 2015, like her permit required, we gave it 24 hours. Sometimes experienced hikers run late, get caught up in getting the perfect shot, lose track of time. But Iris was methodical. Her friends said she was never late for anything, let alone something as important as a check-in. I remember the morning we got the call to start the search, October 16th, 6 a.m. The Pacific Northwest was deep into its autumn routine, temperatures dropping to the mid-40s at night, fog rolling in from the coast like clockwork, and that particular quality of light that made everything look both beautiful and somehow ominous, the kind of light photographers love and search and rescue teams learn to dread. I was paired with Marcus Chen, a rookie ranger who'd transferred from the desert parks in Arizona 6 months earlier. Good kid, eager to prove himself, but he kept making these comments about how different everything was here. Back in Saguaro, you could see for miles, he'd say, squinting up at the canopy that blocked out most of the sky. How do you track anyone in this? He had a point. The Olympic Peninsula rainforest is like nowhere else in America. Trees that have been growing since before Columbus landed, some of them 20 feet in diameter, moss hanging everywhere like green curtains, ground so soft and spongy that footprints disappear in hours. And the fog, Jesus, the fog. It rolls in without warning and turns familiar trails into alien landscapes. We started at Iris's last known location, the Hoh River trailhead, where her Honda Civic was still parked. Her campsite was supposed to be about 8 miles in, near the junction of the Hoh River Trail and the South Fork Trail. Standard procedure, we'd hike in, establish a base camp, then spread out in a grid pattern to cover the area systematically. The first sign something was wrong came before we even reached her intended campsite. About 6 miles in, we found one of her lens caps hanging from a branch about 7 feet off the ground. Not dropped, hung. Deliberately placed like some kind of marker. Maybe she was marking her path? Marcus suggested, but I could tell he didn't believe it even as he said it. You don't mark a trail by throwing your expensive camera equipment into trees. No, I said, bagging the lens cap. This is something else. We found her actual campsite 2 miles further in, and it looked like she'd left in a hurry. Tent still up but not properly secured. Sleeping bag half out of the tent like she'd been dragged from it. Her camera was missing, but her backup batteries were scattered around the fire ring. Most telling of all, her bare canister, the hard-sided container where she was supposed to store all her food, was open and empty, but there were no signs of bear activity. No claw marks, no scat, no torn fabric. What do you think? Marcus asked, photographing the scene with his phone. Bear scared her off in the middle of the night? I was about to agree when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Boot prints in the soft earth around her tent. Not hers. Too big, probably a size 11 or 12. And they circled the tent. Not the random pattern you'd expect from someone stumbling around in the dark, but methodical. Deliberate, like someone had been watching her sleep. Marcus, I said quietly. Get on the radio. Tell base camp we need the sheriff's department out here. That's when we heard it for the first time. A child's voice, high and clear, calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. Help me. Please, someone help me. We both froze. The voice was coming from the south, maybe a quarter-mile away, past a thick stand of Sitka spruce where the forest floor disappeared into a tangle of fallen logs and devil's club. Jesus, Marcus whispered. Is that another missing person? Standard protocol said we should radio it in before investigating, establish communication with base camp, coordinate our response. But that voice, it sounded so scared, so desperate. A child, lost and terrified somewhere in those woods. "Help, I can't find my mommy." We looked at each other and I made the decision that still haunts me. "Come on," I said. "We can't leave a kid out there." We followed the voice deeper into the forest, our radios crackling with static as the canopy grew thicker overhead. The fog was starting to roll in from the coast, turning the spaces between the trees into a gray maze. Every time we thought we were getting close, the voice would seem to come from a different direction. "Hello," I called out. "We're park rangers. Stay where you are. We're coming to help you." The response chilled my blood. Laughter. Not the relieved laughter of a found child, but something else. Something wrong. It sounded like a child laughing, but there was an adult intelligence behind it, a cruel amusement that no kid should possess. Marcus grabbed my arm. "Thane, I don't like this." Neither did I, but we were already a quarter mile from Iris's campsite, and the fog was getting thicker. I tried the radio. "Base camp, this is Whitmore. We're investigating a possible second missing person, juvenile, requesting immediate backup at coordinates." Static. Dead air. "Base camp, do you copy?" Nothing. Marcus was checking his radio too, getting the same result. "Must be the canopy," he said, but his voice was shaky. "Or the fog interfering with the signal." The child's voice came again, closer now. "I see you. I see you looking for me." We both spun around, but there was nothing. Just trees and mist and the growing certainty that we were being watched. That's when Marcus spotted the trail marker. It was carved into the bark of a massive Douglas fir, about chest height. Not a standard Park Service marker. This was crude, personal. It looked like it had been made with a hunting knife, just a simple arrow pointing deeper into the forest. Below it, in the same rough carving, were the initials IB, Iris Blackwood. "She came this way," I said, though something about the carving bothered me. The cuts looked fresh, but they also looked wrong somehow. Too deep, made with too much force. Like whoever carved them was angry. We followed the arrows. There were 5 of them, each one carved into a different tree, leading us further from any established trail. The forest was changing around us, becoming older, more primeval. The trees were massive here, some of them easily 800 years old, their trunks disappearing up into the fog like the pillars of some ancient cathedral. And it was quiet. Too quiet. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, none of the usual forest sounds. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the moss and mist. The 5th arrow led to a clearing I'd never seen in 7 years of patrolling these woods. It was maybe 30 feet across, ringed by the largest trees I'd ever encountered. In the center was a circle of stones that definitely weren't natural. They'd been arranged by human hands, and recently, some of them still had dirt clinging to them, like they'd been dug up from somewhere else. But it was what was inside the stone circle that made my breath catch in my throat. Bones. Animal bones, mostly, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. Deer skulls with the antlers twisted into impossible shapes. Bird skeletons laid out like some kind of ritualistic display. And in the very center, too fresh to be part of whatever sick ceremony this was supposed to be, was Iris's camera. Marcus started forward, but I grabbed his arm. Don't touch anything." "But the camera?" I said, "Don't touch it." Something was very wrong here. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. Someone was playing games with us, and I had the growing suspicion that someone had been playing games with Iris too. The child's voice came again, but this time it was different, older. "You found my special place." We spun around, and there he was, standing at the edge of the clearing like he'd just stepped out of the trees. A man in his 40s, maybe 50, wearing military surplus gear and carrying a hunting rifle. His face was weathered and bearded with the kind of deep tan you only get from living outdoors for months at a time. But it was his eyes that made my skin crawl. They were bright blue and completely calm, like finding 2 armed park rangers in his secret bone circle was the most natural thing in the world. "Vincent Coren," he said, like he was introducing himself at a church social. "Former Marine, current resident of these beautiful woods. And you gentlemen are trespassing on my property." I kept my voice steady, professional, This is federal land, sir. Olympic National Park. I'm Ranger Whitmore. This is Ranger Chen. We're conducting a search and rescue operation for a missing camper. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying smile I'd ever seen. Oh, you mean little Iris? Pretty girl. Takes beautiful pictures. Took some beautiful pictures of me, actually, before she understood the situation she was in. My hand moved to the service weapon on my belt, but Corin was faster. The rifle was aimed at my chest before I could clear leather. Now, he said. No need for that. We're all civilized people here. Well, mostly civilized. Iris and I have been playing a little game for the past 2 days. Hide and seek, you might call it. She's gotten very good at hiding. Where is she? Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with fear and adrenaline. Close, Corin said. Very close. In fact, she should be watching us right now. Aren't you, Iris? Come on out, darling. Show these nice rangers how well you've learned to move through the forest. Silence. Nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the distant drip of condensation from the trees. Corin's smile widened. Shy, isn't she? Or maybe she's finally figured out the rules of our little game. The first rule is, don't get caught. The second rule is, if you do get caught, it's over. What do you want? I asked. Want? I want to be left alone to pursue my hobby. You see, gentlemen, I've been living in these woods for 3 years now. Ever since I got tired of hunting animals. They're too predictable, you understand. No real challenge. But people are interesting. They think, they adapt, they surprise you. He gestured with the rifle toward the bone circle. This used to be a sacred site, you know. The local tribes considered it a place where the spirit world and our world touched. They buried their dead here for centuries before the white man came and civilized everything. I've been excavating, learning, and I've discovered that the old stories are true. This place has power. As if on cue, the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees. Not gradually, like normal weather change, but all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door. Our breath started misting in the suddenly frigid air, and that's when we heard them. Voices, dozens of voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The fog swirled around us, and for just a moment I could swear I saw shapes in it. Human shapes, but wrong somehow. Too tall, or with too many limbs or faces that were just slightly off. Marcus stumbled backward, his face white with terror. What the hell? The spirits don't like visitors, Corin said conversationally, as if the supernatural Arctic blast and phantom voices were perfectly normal. They especially don't like people who disturb their rest. But they've made an exception for me. We have an understanding, you might say. The voices were getting louder, more insistent. And I could swear some of them were speaking English now, though the words were unclear, like they were being spoken underwater or from a great distance. You're insane, I said. Am I? Or am I the only one who's been paying attention? Tell me, Ranger Whitmore, in all your years patrolling these woods, haven't you ever felt like you were being watched? Haven't you ever heard voices when there was no one around? Haven't you ever found campsites that were disturbed in ways that didn't make sense? The horrible thing was, he was right. There had been incidents over the years. Campers reporting strange sounds in the night. Hikers claiming they'd seen figures watching them from the tree line. Equipment failures in specific areas that our techs could never explain. I'd always written it off as imagination, stress, the natural human tendency to see patterns where none existed. But now, standing in that circle with the voices of the dead whispering around us and the temperature plummeting, I was beginning to understand that I'd been very, very wrong. Where is Iris Blackwood? I demanded. Corin tilted his head like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. The spirits want to show you. They want you to understand what happens to people who wander into places they don't belong. He gestured with the rifle toward a gap in the trees I hadn't noticed before. That way, both of you. And gentlemen, don't try anything heroic. The spirits are hungry, and they don't much care whether I feed them rangers or photographers. We had no choice. With the rifle trained on us and those impossible voices growing louder, we walked where he pointed. The gap led to a narrow trail that descended steeply through a grove of ancient cedars. The fog was so thick now that we could barely see 10 feet ahead. The trail ended at what looked like a natural amphitheater, a bowl-shaped depression in the forest floor surrounded by massive trees. And there, tied to one of the trees with climbing rope, was Iris Blackwood. She was alive, but barely. She'd been out here for 2 days and it showed. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and mud. But her eyes were the worst part. They held a knowledge that no 19-year-old should possess, the look of someone who'd seen things that had broken something fundamental inside her. Iris. Marcus started forward, but Corin swung the rifle his way. She's exactly where she needs to be. The spirits told me this is a special place, a doorway. They've been very clear about what needs to happen here. Iris looked up at us, and when she spoke, her voice was hoarse from screaming. Don't let him. There's something wrong with this place. Something really wrong. The voices, they never stop. And that's when I heard it clearly for the first time. The voices weren't just random whispers anymore. They were speaking English, and they were speaking to me. Thane, my name clear as day, in a voice that sounded exactly like my father's. My father, who'd been dead for 3 years. Dad? The word came out of my mouth before I could stop it. Thane, you need to run. You need to get out of here now. But there were other voices too. A woman's voice that sounded like my ex-girlfriend Sarah. He's going to kill you all. A child's voice that might have been my nephew. The bad man talks to us. He makes us do things. Marcus was hearing them too. I could tell by the way his face had gone chalk white and his hands were shaking. Amazing, isn't it? Corin said. They know things. They see things. They've been very helpful in my hunting expeditions. They tell me where people are going to be, what they're going to do. They told me about Iris 3 days before she even arrived at the park. He walked over to where she was tied and ran the barrel of his rifle along her cheek. She flinched away, but there was nowhere to go. They also told me about you two, Rangers Whitmore and Chen, coming to investigate the missing photographer. They were very specific about what I needed to do to make this work. Make what work? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. The feeding. You see, the spirits aren't just voices, they're hungry. They've been hungry for a very long time, and they've offered me a deal. I provide them with offerings, and they help me become the perfect hunter. They tell me where my prey is, how to avoid search parties, when to strike and when to wait. The voices were getting louder, more insistent. I could hear dozens of them now, maybe hundreds, speaking in a babble of languages and dialects. But underneath it all, cutting through the supernatural chaos, was something else. Something that made my blood turn to ice. Footsteps, heavy boots on dead leaves, circling us in the fog. The beautiful thing, Corin continued, is that once someone dies here in this place, they join the chorus. They become part of the hunting pack. Iris here is going to be a wonderful addition. Young, intelligent, experienced in the woods. She'll be able to guide me to other campers, other hikers, other photographers who wander off alone thinking they're safe. He raised the rifle, pointing it at Iris's head. That's when Marcus did something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. He lunged forward, shouting, "No!" The rifle swung toward him, and I heard the shot echo through the forest. Marcus spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Foolish," Corin said, working the bolt to chamber another round. But the spirits appreciate the gesture. They like courage. Makes the meat taste better. I looked at Marcus, bleeding on the forest floor, and at Iris, tied helpless to the tree. And I made a decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of going for my weapon, instead of trying to rush a man with a rifle, I did something he wasn't expecting. I started cutting Iris free. "What are you doing?" he demanded, swinging the rifle back toward me. "What you want," I said, sawing through the rope with my utility knife. "Feeding the spirits, but you've got it wrong. They don't want victims. They want hunters." It was a desperate bluff, but something in the way the voices had been speaking to me made me think I might be onto something. They hadn't sounded hungry. They'd sounded trapped. Iris fell forward as the ropes parted, and I caught her. She was weak, dehydrated, but she was alive. The spirits aren't your allies, I continued, helping her to her feet. They're prisoners. You've been feeding them, but you've also been keeping them here, bound to this place by violence and death. They want to be free. Corin's confidence wavered for the first time. That's not... They told me. They told you what you wanted to hear. They've been using you, just like you've been using them. The voices were changing now, becoming clearer, more distinct, and what they were saying made Corin's face go pale. Liar. Killer. Murderer. We see what you are. No, he said, backing away. No, we had a deal. The deal is over, I said, and somehow I knew it was true. You broke it the moment you brought us here. The moment you involved innocent people in your sick games. The fog was swirling faster now, and the temperature was dropping even further. The voices were becoming a roar, dozens of spirits speaking in unison. Free us. End this. Make him pay. Corin raised the rifle again, but his hands were shaking. I'll kill you all. I'll feed you all to them. That's when the forest itself seemed to come alive. The fog condensed into shapes. Human shapes. But twisted and wrong, with too many limbs and faces that shifted and changed. They rose from the ground like smoke, surrounded us on all sides, and I could feel their hunger, their rage, their desperate need for justice. But they weren't looking at us. They were looking at him. Corin screamed and fired into the fog, but the bullets passed harmlessly through the apparitions. They kept coming, reaching for him with hands made of mist and shadow and 3 years of accumulated rage. Run, I told Iris and Marcus. Run now. We stumbled through the forest, following the voices that were no longer threatening but guiding, helping us find our way back toward the established trails. Behind us, I could hear Corin screaming, the sound getting fainter and more desperate until it cut off entirely. We found the main trail just as the fog began to lift and our radios crackled back to life. The rescue team found us 20 minutes later, and we were airlifted to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles. Marcus needed surgery on his shoulder, but he made a full recovery. Iris spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for dehydration and exposure, but physically, she was fine. Mentally, that was another story. The official report said we'd encountered an armed survivalist who had taken Iris hostage, and that he'd fled into the wilderness when confronted by rangers. A manhunt was organized, but Vincent Corin was never found. Neither was his body. But I know what happened to him. I know because I went back 3 weeks later to the place where we'd left him. The bone circle was gone. The carved trail markers had vanished, and that amphitheater-like depression where Iris had been tied up was just another part of the forest floor, covered in dead leaves and moss like it had been undisturbed for centuries. The only sign that anything had happened there was the silence. The same unnatural quiet we'd encountered before, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I requested a transfer the next month. There were openings in several eastern parks, and I chose Acadia National Park in Maine. Different trees, different terrain, different energy entirely. I told myself I needed a change of scenery, needed to get away from the memories. But the truth was, I was afraid. Not of Corin. I was certain he was gone for good. I was afraid of the voices, because even after the spirits had their justice, even after they'd taken their revenge on the man who'd been using them, I could still hear them sometimes, whispering in the wind, calling my name from empty trails, reminding me that there are places in this world where the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we like to believe. I lasted 6 months in Maine before I quit the Park Service entirely. Came here to Vermont, took a job with the State Forestry Service, indoor work mostly, planning and paperwork and coordinating with local departments on fire prevention. I haven't spent a night alone in the woods since October 2015. Iris recovered mostly. She changed her major from art to psychology, graduated summa cum laude, and now works as a trauma counselor in Seattle. We stay in touch. She sends me Christmas cards every year, always with the same message. Thanks for bringing me home. Marcus transferred to Death Valley National Park and loves it there. You can see everything coming for miles, he told me when I called him last year. No fog, no voices, no surprises. Just rock and sky and silence. But sometimes when the fog rolls in heavy here in Vermont and the temperature drops without warning, I still hear them. The voices of everyone who ever got lost in those ancient woods and never found their way home. They're not angry anymore, not trapped, but they remember. They remember Vincent Coren, and they remember us. And they remember that there are still people out there who think the wilderness is empty, harmless, just trees and rocks and animals. Those people are wrong. The wilderness is full of things we don't understand, things that have been there since long before we arrived and will be there long after we're gone. Most of the time, those things are content to let us pass through, to pretend we're the dominant species on this planet. But sometimes when someone like Corin comes along, someone who thinks they can use the darkness for their own purposes, the wilderness fights back. I've never told this story to anyone except my therapist, and she thinks most of it was stress-induced hallucination brought on by the trauma of the situation. She's probably right. The human mind can play terrible tricks on us when we're pushed to our limits. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that there are places in this world where reality works differently, where the past and present bleed together, where the dead don't always stay buried. The Olympic Peninsula is one of those places. Those ancient forests have been growing for thousands of years, accumulating stories and secrets and spirits like rings in a tree trunk. Most visitors never see anything more than beautiful scenery and fresh air, but some do. Some people stumble into the wrong clearing at the wrong time, or camp in the wrong spot, or catch the attention of something that should have been left alone. And some of them never come home. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in the deep woods, anywhere, not just the Olympics, and you hear voices calling your name, don't follow them. If you find trail markers that aren't on any official map, don't trust them. If you discover clearings that feel wrong, that make your skin crawl for no reason you can name, turn around and walk away. And if you ever encounter someone like Vincent Coren, someone who's made peace with the darkness and learned to use it for their own twisted ends, remember that the darkness always collects its debts eventually. The forest remembers everything, and it never forgets a debt unpaid. I still wake up at 3 a.m. sometimes, listening for voices in the Vermont fog. My wife thinks they're nightmares, and maybe she's right. Maybe that's all they are now. Echoes of trauma, my mind's way of processing something too terrible to fully understand. But on nights when the fog is thick and the temperature drops without warning, when the silence stretches too long and the shadows seem to move on their own, I remember that clearing in the Olympic rainforest. I remember the bone circle and the voices and the moment when the boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond it became thin enough to step through. And I remember Vincent Coren's face in those final moments, when he realized that the spirits he thought he'd been commanding had been manipulating him all along, using him to lure their real targets. People like him. People who would disturb the ancient peace of those woods for their own dark purposes. Justice, I suppose. The kind of justice that doesn't come from courts or law enforcement, but from something older and more fundamental. The justice of the forest itself, protecting its own from those who would corrupt it. I don't go into the deep woods anymore. I stay on the marked trails, stick to the popular areas, never venture out alone. Some people might call that cowardice, but I call it wisdom. I learned something in that October fog that most people never have to learn. We are not the apex predators we think we are. There are things in this world that are older, hungrier, and infinitely more patient than we can imagine. And they're always listening, always watching, always waiting for someone foolish enough to think they can make a deal with the darkness and come out ahead. The voices have been quiet lately. Maybe that means the debt has been paid in full. Maybe it means the spirits have found their peace and moved on to whatever comes next. Or maybe it just means they're waiting for the next Vincent Coren to wander into their domain, thinking he's the hunter when he's really just the next meal. Either way, I'll be staying here in Vermont, where the forests are young and the fog is just fog and the only voices in the night are the ones that belong to the living. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. Some knowledge once gained changes you forever. And some places should never be disturbed, no matter how much we think we understand them. The Olympic Peninsula is one of those places. Beautiful, ancient, and home to things that are best left undisturbed. Take my advice. If you ever find yourself planning a solo camping trip in the deep woods, remember Iris Blackwood. Remember Vincent Corin. Remember that the forest has its own rules, its own justice, and its own way of dealing with those who break both. And remember that not all the predators in the wilderness walk on four legs. Some of them used to be human, and some of them never were human at all. I shouldn't be telling this. My wife said it's better to leave the past buried, but you people who follow real stories deserve to know the truth about what happens in the forests when the sun goes down. My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm 29 years old and currently live in Phoenix, Arizona. 5 years ago, I was a forest ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington. What I'm about to tell you is why I abandoned that profession in the middle of the night and could never sleep again without leaving all the lights on. Sorry if my voice shakes at some points. This is the first time I'm telling this completely to someone outside of therapy. Here in Arizona, with the scorching sun and open desert, sometimes I can convince myself it was all just a nightmare. But when night falls, I still hear those voices. It was October 2019. I had only 8 months working at Olympic, still trying to prove I deserved to be there. You need to understand, Olympic National Park isn't like the parks here in Arizona. There in Washington, when October comes, darkness swallows everything at 5 in the afternoon. The trees are so dense that even during the day you walk in a green, humid twilight. It's a place where silence has its own weight, where every sound echoes strangely between the giant trunks. I was the rookie on the team. I had moved from Arizona precisely to work in a real forest, not in the desert. The irony. Now I'm back here, swearing never to step foot in a forest alone again. The Mera Castellanos case started on a Tuesday morning, October 15th. She was a freelance photographer from Seattle, 28 years old, specialized in wildlife. She had come to Olympic to document the autumn colors for a nature magazine. A small woman, curly brown hair, always with that smile that appeared in photos of her previous work. The last record of her was Monday night when she checked into the lodge near the park entrance. Tuesday morning, her room was empty. The bed hadn't been used, but her car remained in the parking lot. The cameras, equipment, everything abandoned in the room. The supervisor assigned me to lead the initial search. First time I would be responsible for a missing person case. I remember the weight of responsibility crushing my shoulders. A life depended on my decisions, and I barely knew the more remote trails of the park. We started following the last trail she had marked on the map found in her room, the Enchanted Valley Trail. It's a 26-kilometer trail that winds through Washington's densest temperate forest, climbing up to a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks. In autumn, it's breathtakingly beautiful, but also too isolated. If something happened there... It was 10 in the morning when we started the search with a team of 6 people. Me, my veteran partner Dale Morrison, 2 other rangers, and 2 experienced volunteers. The protocol was simple. Follow the trail, look for signs, establish radio communication every 15 minutes. But from the beginning, something was wrong. First was the silence. You know, in a forest there are always sounds, birds, squirrels, wind in the leaves. But as we advanced on the trail, everything became too quiet, as if the animals had fled from something. Then came the smell. In Arizona, when something dies in the desert, the smell is dry, almost odorless because of the heat. But in a humid forest, it's different. It's sweet and nauseating, sticks to your throat. And it was coming from somewhere ahead. Dale, who had 15 years of experience, stopped abruptly. "Marcus," he said, his voice low. "Are you feeling this?" I nodded. The smell was getting stronger. We continued for another 200 meters until we found the source. It wasn't Mera. It was a male elk, huge, fallen in the middle of the trail. But there were no signs of predators, no bullet marks. The animal simply was there. Dead. Eyes open, staring at the gray sky. "This is strange," Dale murmured, examining the carcass. "No visible wounds. And look at the marks around." That's when I saw it. In the muddy ground around the elk there were footprints. Human footprints. Hiking boots approximately size 11. Fresh. "Someone was here recently," I said into the radio to base. "We found a dead elk and fresh human footprints. Could be Mera's or whoever saw her last." The response came loaded with static. "Copy, Marcus. Continue following the footprints. Maintain constant communication." But when we tried to follow the footprints, they simply disappeared. After 20 meters, it was as if the person had evaporated. No more marks in the mud, no broken branches, nothing. Dale frowned. In 15 years, he had never seen anything like this. "Must have jumped to a rock or fallen log," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We continued on the main trail. 2 hours later, we found the first real clue about Mera. One of her camera lenses cracked, half buried in the dead leaves about 20 meters off the trail. "Base, this is Marcus. We found equipment from the missing person. A camera lens. Looks like she was forced off the trail." "Copy, Marcus. What's the condition of the lens?" I examined the piece of glass. There was something on the edges that made my stomach turn. Looks like dried blood on the edges. Not much, but definitely blood. That's when we heard the first sound. A cry. Weak, distant, coming from somewhere further ahead in the forest, like a child crying. All of us stopped. Dale grabbed the radio. "Are you hearing this?" The crying continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. "Could be her," whispered one of the volunteers. "Could be injured." We left the main trail, heading toward the sound. The forest here was denser, the branches forming an almost impenetrable ceiling. Even though it was noon, it felt like we were walking at twilight. 10 minutes later, the crying started again. Louder now, closer, but there was something wrong with the sound, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. "That's not an adult woman," Dale murmured. "It's a child. A small child." But there were no missing children in the area. Only Mera. We continued following the sound, but it seemed to always come from a different place. First to the left, then to the right, sometimes from above, as if it came from the treetops. That's when we found the improvised camp, a small clearing surrounded by enormous trees. In the center, the remains of a recent fire. Around it, marks on the ground as if someone had dragged something heavy, and hanging on a low branch, a piece of red fabric. Dale examined the fabric. "It's from her jacket," the description matched, red hiking jacket. But the camp didn't seem right. There was no tent, no camping equipment, just the fire and those strange marks on the ground, and the smell. That sweet, nauseating smell was stronger here. "Base, we found signs of the missing person's camp," I reported. "But the situation is complicated. Looks like she wasn't alone." "Explain complicated, Marcus." I looked at Dale, who shook his head negatively. "There are signs that another person was here, someone with survival experience, and..." I hesitated. "And there's evidence that something was dragged." A long silence from the radio, then, "Hold position. We're sending reinforcements and the investigation team." But reinforcements would take at least 2 hours to arrive. And the day was getting dark faster than it should. At 3 in the afternoon, the forest was already plunged into a strange twilight. That's when Dale found the footprints around the camp. They weren't just the size 11 ones we had seen before. There were others, smaller, bare feet. "Marcus," his voice was tense, "look at this." The bare footprints were small, about the size of maybe an 8 or 9-year-old child. But there was something deeply disturbing about them. They didn't follow a normal walking pattern. They were erratic, sometimes overlapping, as if the person had been dancing or convulsing. And all the footprints led out of the clearing, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. "This doesn't make sense," I murmured. There are no missing children. And these footprints. Dale was crouched, examining one of the clearest marks. When he stood up, his face was pale. "Marcus, look at the toes on these footprints." I crouched beside him. In the muddy ground, the footprint was perfectly clear. 5 toes, but they were too long, distorted, as if they had been stretched. A chill ran down my spine. That wasn't human. That's when we heard the voice. Marcus, my name. Someone had whispered my name, coming from the darkness between the trees. All of us froze. Dale drew his weapon. "Marcus, help!" The voice was female, weak, desperate. Could be Mera. "Mera?" I shouted. "Mera Castellanos? Are you there?" Silence. Then more whispers coming from different directions. "Marcus. Help. Please." But there was something about the voices. They echoed strangely, as if they came from very far away and very close at the same time. Dale had the radio in his hand, but only static came out. "Damn," he grumbled. "We lost communication." The whispers continued. My name being called from various points in the forest. Sometimes it was a female voice, sometimes male. Sometimes it sounded like my mother's voice, who had died 3 years earlier. "Don't respond," Dale whispered to the team. "Something here isn't right." But one of the volunteers, a guy named Jeff, couldn't control himself. "Mera," he shouted. "Where are you? We're from the rescue team." The effect was immediate. The voices stopped. The forest became completely silent, not even the wind. Then, the footsteps started. They weren't normal human steps. They were heavy, deliberate, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, as if whoever was walking had legs of different sizes. The steps came from several directions, slowly surrounding us. "Defensive formation," Dale ordered. "Weapons ready." But when we drew our flashlights, the batteries were dead. All of them. New batteries we had tested that morning. "This is impossible," murmured one of the rangers. That's when we saw the first figure, a shadow between the trees about 50 meters away. Tall, but with something wrong with its posture. It moved strangely, as if it didn't have joints in the right places. "Who's there?" Dale shouted. "Identify yourself." The figure stopped, then slowly began to approach. As it got closer, we could see more details. It was definitely human, but not completely. The arms were too long. The head was at a strange angle. And the eyes. The eyes reflected our light like an animal's. "Jesus Christ," Jeff whispered. The figure stopped 10 meters away. When it spoke, it was with multiple overlapping voices. "Marcus, why didn't you answer when I called?" It was my mother. It was Mera. It was a child. All at the same time. Dale fired 2 shots in the air. The sound echoed through the forest like thunder. The figure vanished. Simply disappeared. "We run," Dale ordered. "Now." But when we turned to go back down the trail, it wasn't there anymore. In the place where the path back should have been, there was only more forest. Dense, dark, impenetrable. "This is impossible," I said, my voice trembling. The trail was right here. We grabbed the GPSs. They all showed the same thing. Unknown location. As if we were in a place that didn't exist on maps. That's when we heard the crying again. But now it wasn't distant. It was very close, coming from above our heads. We looked up. In the branches of the nearest tree, there was a child. But it wasn't a normal child. It was hanging upside down, its long hair swaying in the air. And it was crying tears of blood. When it saw us looking, it smiled. Its teeth were too sharp. "Want to play?" it asked, its voice echoing impossibly. Jeff screamed and ran, simply ran into the darkness of the forest. "Jeff, no!" Dale shouted, but it was too late. We heard Jeff running through the woods, branches breaking, his heavy breathing moving away. Then, a scream. A scream that lasted a long time, getting higher and higher until it became something that was no longer human. Then silence. The child in the tree laughed. A laugh that sounded like glass being broken. "One less," it said. "How many are left to play?" Dale, me, and the other two rangers moved closer to each other, forming a defensive circle. Dale tried the radio again, but now not even static came out. The device was completely dead. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. "Whatever this is, it's not natural." But how to get out when we didn't know where we were? We started walking in a random direction, staying together. The forest seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. The trees were all the same, sounds echoed strangely, and I had the growing feeling that we were walking in circles. After an hour of walking, we arrived at a clearing that I immediately recognized. It was the same camp where we had found the piece of Mera's jacket. "This is impossible," I murmured. "We didn't come back the way we came." Dale checked the compass. The needle spun endlessly, never pointing in the same direction for more than a few seconds. "Our equipment is being interfered with," he said, "by something that shouldn't exist." That's when we saw the smoke, a thin column of white smoke rising from somewhere further ahead in the forest. Fresh smoke from a fire that had been lit recently. "Could be Jeff," said one of the rangers. "Could have found shelter." But Dale shook his head. "Jeff didn't have matches, and you heard his scream." Even so, it was our only clue. We started following toward the smoke. 10 minutes later, we arrived at another clearing. This one was bigger, with a fire in the center crackling merrily. Around the fire, there were structures made of branches and ropes, traps, and hanging in those traps. God forgive me. Hanging in those traps were parts of animals. And some weren't from animals. Dale vomited. One of the rangers started crying, and that's when we heard the voice. A real human voice this time. Male, rough, coming from behind the trees. "Welcome to my territory." A man emerged from the shadows, tall, thin, with a long, unkempt beard. Worn military clothes, but he moved with the precision of someone with combat training. In his eyes there was a cold, calculating intelligence. "My name is Vernon Krause," he said, as if introducing himself at a party. "Former Army Ranger. This forest has been my home for 7 years." Dale tried to draw his weapon, but Vernon already had a shotgun pointed at us. "I wouldn't do that," Vernon said calmly. "You're outnumbered, and out of your territory." "Where is Mera Castellanos?" Dale asked, his voice firm despite the fear. Vernon smiled. It was the most disturbing smile I've ever seen in my life. "The photographer? She was useful for a few days, but she made too much noise. Didn't respect the rules of the forest." My stomach churned. "What did you do to her?" "I freed her," Vernon said, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Freed her from the constraints of civilization. Now she's part of the forest forever." That's when I realized we weren't just prisoners of a psychopath. The things we had seen, the child in the tree, the whispering voices, the distorted footprints. Vernon was behind all of this. He knew the forest in a way no normal human being should know. "How did you do that?" I asked. "The child in the tree, the voices." Vernon laughed. 7 years alone in this forest teaches you things. The forest speaks to those who know how to listen, and I learned to speak back. He gestured to the structures around the fire. "Each of these traps is consecrated. Each death feeds something greater. And in return," he paused, his eyes becoming empty. "In return, I receive assistance." As if responding to his words, we heard again the voices whispering our names, coming from all directions. "You came at the right time," Vernon continued. "The new moon is coming. That's when the barriers become thinner, when I can offer greater gifts." Dale tried to take a step back, but Vernon pointed the shotgun directly at his chest. "Oh no, you're not going anywhere, not until the ceremony." "What ceremony?" I asked. though I already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. The same one the photographer participated in, the same one your friend Jeff is participating in now. That's when we heard the screams. Coming from somewhere in the darkness, screams of agony that seemed endless. And between the screams, that child's laughter we had heard before. "Is Jeff still alive?" asked one of the rangers. "Technically," Vernon replied, "but not for much longer. The transformation is uncomfortable." Transformation. The word echoed in my mind. The distorted footprints, the child with sharp teeth, the voices that sounded like echoes of multiple people. "You're transforming people," I said, the realization hitting me like a punch. "Not me," Vernon corrected. "The forest is. I just facilitate the process." He turned to the fire and threw something in the flames, a substance that made the flames turn green and emit a sweet, nauseating smoke. Immediately I started feeling dizzy. The others too. Dale staggered, trying to stay on his feet. "What is this?" I murmured. "Just something to make you more receptive," Vernon said. "The transformation works better when the mind is open." The voices around us got louder. Now I could distinguish words. "Join us. The forest is waiting. Don't resist." But through the drug's haze, my mind somehow remained clear enough to realize one thing. Vernon was alone. However terrifying he was just one man, and we were still 3 against 1. I made a discreet signal to Dale. He understood. In a coordinated movement, Dale threw himself to the left while I threw myself to the right. Vernon shot, but the shot passed between us. I launched myself at him, knocking him to the ground. The shotgun flew away. Dale ran to get it. But Vernon was stronger than he appeared. He kicked me in the stomach, making me fly backward. When he got up, his eyes were no longer human. They were completely black, like 2 holes in his face. "You don't understand," he said, his voice now echoing as if coming from inside a cave. "You can't escape. The forest has already chosen you." That's when things became really impossible. The trees around the clearing began to move, not the wind shaking the branches, the trees themselves bending, the trunks folding as if they were made of rubber. Roots emerged from the ground, slithering in our direction like giant snakes. Dale shot with the shotgun, but Vernon had already disappeared. He simply dissolved into the darkness like smoke. "Run!" Dale shouted. We ran. We ran through the forest that now seemed alive and hostile. Branches stretched out to grab us. Roots sprouted from the ground to make us trip. The voices followed us, screaming our names, begging us to stop. We ran for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, when our lungs were on fire and our legs could no longer carry us, we stopped in a small clearing. Dale checked the radio. Still dead. The GPSs continued showing unknown location. "Where do we go?" one of the rangers asked, his voice desperate. I didn't know. None of this made sense. We were lost in a forest I knew like the back of my hand, pursued by a man who wasn't completely human and surrounded by phenomena that defied all logic. That's when I saw the light. A weak light, but definitely artificial, shining through the trees. Electric light. "Over there," I whispered, pointing to the light. We approached cautiously. Through the branches we could see a small cabin, old, covered with moss, but with electric light in the windows. Dale grabbed my arm. Could be a trap. But we had no choice. It was our only hope. We approached the cabin. The door was ajar. From inside came the sound of a radio playing static music. Dale pushed the door slowly. The interior of the cabin was a collection of horrors. Photographs covered all the walls. Hundreds of them. Photographs of people in the forest. Some looked like normal tourists. Others showed people in various stages of decomposition. And in the center of the back wall, a large photo of Mera. She was tied to a tree, terrified eyes fixed on the camera, alive in the photo, but there was something in her expression, as if she knew she wouldn't leave there alive. Dale found a shortwave radio still working on an improvised table. He quickly tuned to the emergency frequency. Base, this is Dale Morrison. Code red. We need immediate evacuation. Multiple casualties. Armed and dangerous suspect. The response came loaded with static but was audible. Dale? Where the hell are you? We lost contact 8 hours ago. 8 hours? It felt like we had been in the forest for days. We don't know our location, Dale responded. GPS not working. Suspect identifies as Vernon Krause, ex-military. He killed the missing person and at least one member of our team. Copy, Dale. We're tracking your signal. Rescue team en route. But when Dale turned off the radio, we realized we weren't alone in the cabin. In the darkest corner, a figure was sitting in an old chair. It wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. When Dale pointed the flashlight, it was Jeff, or what was left of him. He was still alive, technically. His eyes blinked, his mouth moved without making sound. But the body had been modified. Arms and legs were at an impossible angle. The skin had a gray-greenish color, and from the neck down, there were things, growths that shouldn't exist on any human being. When Jeff saw us, he tried to speak. Only a weak moan came from his throat. Dale vomited again. One of the rangers fainted. God forgive me, I whispered. What did they do to him? That's when we heard Vernon's voice coming from outside the cabin. He's adapting to the forest's needs. In a few days, he'll be completely functional. Vernon appeared in the doorway, but now he wasn't alone. Beside him, there were 3 figures. One was the child we had seen in the tree. The other 2 were people I didn't recognize, but who had clearly gone through the same process as Jeff. You found my museum, Vernon said, gesturing to the photographs. 23 people in the last 7 years, each contributing to the growth of our community. You're a monster, Dale said, pointing the shotgun at Vernon. I'm an evolutionist, Vernon corrected. Humanity is limited by its physical form, but the forest offers infinite possibilities. The 3 figures beside him moved into the cabin. Now we could see them better. They had been human once, but now they were something else. Extra limbs sprouted from strange places. The faces were a disturbing mixture of human and animal features. You can join us voluntarily, Vernon continued, or I can accelerate the process. The choice is yours. Dale shot. The shot hit Vernon in the chest, throwing him backward. But he got up immediately as if nothing had happened. The hole in his shirt showed flesh regenerating before our eyes. Conventional bullets don't work anymore, Vernon said calmly. Not since I became part of the forest. That's when we heard the helicopters, the sound of rotors cutting through the night air. The rescue team had arrived. Vernon frowned. This is inconvenient. He made a gesture to the creatures beside him. They left the cabin, disappearing into the darkness. You won this round, Vernon said. But the forest is patient, and you will always return. He looked us directly in the eyes, one at a time. You've seen too much. You know too much. This marks you. No matter where you go, no matter how far you run, the forest will call you back. And next time there won't be helicopters. The rescue helicopters landed in the clearing outside. Searchlights flooded the cabin with harsh white light. Shouts from the rescue team echoed through the forest. But when they entered the cabin, Vernon and his creatures were gone. Only we remained, traumatized and shaking, with Jeff's mutilated form as the only evidence of what we had experienced. They airlifted us out that night. Jeff was taken to a specialized medical facility, though the doctors said they had never seen anything like his condition. Officially, he was listed as a victim of an unknown animal attack. The official report stated that Mera Castellanos was found deceased from exposure and wild animal attacks. Vernon Krause was listed as a suspect at large, wanted for questioning in connection with multiple disappearances in the Olympic National Forest area. But I know the truth. Vernon is still out there. And so are the others. The ones he transformed. The ones who became part of his forest community. I quit the Forest Service the day I was released from the hospital. Moved back to Arizona within the week. My wife thinks it was because of the trauma, and she's not wrong. But it's more than that. Sometimes, late at night here in Phoenix, when the desert wind blows through the city, I hear it. Faint, but unmistakable, the sound of voices calling my name, the crying of a child, the whisper of leaves that shouldn't exist in this dry climate. Vernon was right. The forest marked us. And no matter how far I run, no matter how many miles of desert I put between myself and those Washington woods, I know that someday I'll have to go back. Not because I want to, but because the forest is patient, and it's still waiting for me to complete my transformation. That's why I'm telling this story now, because if something happens to me, if I disappear one day without explanation, you'll know where I went. And maybe you'll stay away from the Olympic National Forest on those dark autumn nights when the barriers between worlds grow thin. The forest is always hungry, and Vernon Krause is always recruiting. God help anyone who hears their name being called from between those ancient trees, because once the forest knows you're there, it never lets you go.